Hi everyone, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today we're going to be doing maybe an introductory overview of what has been happening within the AI legislative space. Our clients are frequently coming to us with AI questions, wanting to know what is the latest in legislative and regulatory developments. And oftentimes the questions maybe are outpacing what the legislation actually is. And in this case, we actually have some really tangible directive action that was taken by the federal government. The Biden administration issued quite an extensive executive order, and we have two of my colleagues here to talk about what that executive order is, what does it mean for you, and where do we see the future of AI legislation and regulatory development.
So with that, I'd like to introduce Mark Brennan, who is a partner in our communications, internet, and media practice, and also the head of Hogan Lovells' AI working group, and Harsimar Dhanoa, an associate in our privacy and cybersecurity practice here in BC. Mark, Harsimar, thanks so much for joining me.
Okay, so Mark, maybe I can start with you and let's talk a little bit about the EO itself. Maybe you can just give the audience a perspective on what the EO is and why is it that it was released at this particular moment in time.
Scott, the executive order it's the executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence is a landmark effort intended to establish a comprehensive U.S. strategy for responsible AI innovation. Ultimately, it directs a number of agencies to engage in rulemakings and other proceedings addressing AI, and also to cover a number of the key legal, regulatory, and policy areas that we've seen popping up in the AI space. It's an incredibly thoughtful executive order, and it is notable for the comprehensiveness of all of the different areas that it seeks to identify the ways in which AI technologies may develop and the ways in which the technologies can be used. So it certainly is the largest effort to date by the administration, and it's received a lot of attention on the global stage now for how far-reaching it is.
Mark, I want to hit that point that you just made because I think it's super important around how the legislation looks like and the regulatory environment looks like globally for AI. Because in some ways, we see a pattern here where the US has not developed a comprehensive AI law or even a comprehensive proposal for an AI law. And meanwhile, our friends in Europe have, and they're hotly debating the AI Act. So here we have an AI set of principles, an AI set of developments that are done by executive order. And in Europe, they're actually doing that by legislation. How do you see those two things kind of lined up? Is this just a coincidence, or is this a way where the US is trying to play a more forward-thinking role about what AI legislation looks like in maybe ways that they didn't when the GDPR was released?
It's a really great question, and I think there are a variety of ways to look at the administration's effort here. One would be that the US has entered the chat when it comes to AI regulation. Now, look, anybody that will tell you that AI is currently unregulated or not subject to a number of legal frameworks, that's just wrong. There are a lot of legacy frameworks globally that apply to AI technologies or particular uses of technologies in many of the same ways that we'd otherwise look at our consumer protection frameworks and other efforts. What is different is that the growing wave of efforts to legislate or regulate AI technologies or their use specifically, right? So rather than relying on legacy frameworks, but these new frameworks that are driven by the technology itself, that's where, until this executive order, you had seen a lot more activity out of Europe in particular with the EU AI Act. The UK has also been active on addressing AI issues on the policy space. And what we see now is, as I mentioned, a really comprehensive effort by this administration to explore the issues and the potential areas for harm, for regulation, but also one major difference that I see is that in Europe, there seems to be this emphasis still on regulating the technology directly. So from the US perspective, we tend to think of supporting innovation and technologies and supporting the ability for companies to introduce the technologies to market. And only in rare instances do we tend to regulate ahead of deployment. And usually that's associated with weapons, harmful substances, and things like that. From the EU perspective, I think there's a good amount of the EU AI Act that regulates the technology rather than the particular uses. And what I see happening with the executive order out of the White House is this continued focus, for the most part, on exploring the particular uses that would cause benefits to society, potential harms, and making sure that any regulatory efforts or guidance is tailored specifically to those harms rather than blanket regulation of the technology at the outset. And there are some nuances and exceptions, but that's a key difference I see in the US approach to date.
The next question, Harsimar, goes to you. And you're looking at the executive order, which is quite comprehensive and in some ways kind of gets into the minutia of the way the federal government operates and less important kind of in terms of thinking about what future of AI looks like. Are you seeing any themes, any trends that are come out of the administration's view on what potential AI regulation looks like in the future?
Yeah, Scott, I think that's a great point. And realistically, the focus here has always been around safety as sort of the key piece for AI. I think with the introduction or sort of the spike in popularity of large language models, a lot of regulators started to put their finger on the pulse of AI and say, what can this be used for? How can we keep consumers safe? And so we've seen the White House and the Biden administration sort of take incremental steps, with this EO being sort of the biggest and latest, where they're really trying to focus on working with industry and to build safer tools. Before, one of the steps they had taken was actually working with individual AI developers. The White House managed to secure commitments from, I think last I checked, it was over a dozen companies. And now they've sort of taken that approach and sort of used something more widespread to adopt a whole of government focus.
Interesting. And I think you see this balance even in the way that it's written, of this interaction where it's clear that they're struggling with trying to figure out how is it that we can foster innovation, knowing that there is a lot of great things that AI can create for society and for commerce and for business and for individuals, while at the same time kind of managing those harms. And you mentioned safety as being an example of that. And I think maybe, Mark, we also see the same types of issues come in around bias, around transparency, going into some of the areas where I think there is a lot of concern around how AI may be used, whether those fears are theoretical or real. Well, I think time will tell, but I think they're very real in the way that we can articulate them. How do you see that balance playing out as this executive order was issued, and then how agencies are in charge to start to develop their perspectives on AI?
This raises a fundamental policy theme that I've seen with respect to AI. I feel like it is the first major technology area that, from the time it has been discussed in policy spheres, has always had the comma in the discussion. So anytime for years now that people would talk about AI and machine learning in the policy space, you would always hear them refer to, thinking of the policymakers, the regulators, you would hear them speak about how AI can bring about many benefits to society and change the world in so many incredible positive ways. And then there's the comma. But we also need to be mindful of the harms, the potential harms, and all the ways that things can go wrong. And then you start to hear this list of terrible things. So as a technology, it's the first one that I can think of that really has always had that comma with it. Previous technologies were given a runway to be deployed, be developed, be tested in the market, be adopted and used by citizens for all kinds of wonderful things. And then we'd look at potential side effects, and if there were harms, then those could be addressed in the policy space. But for any number of reasons, AI was always there with the pros and the cons discussed alongside each other. What we have seen in recent years is a not really a balancing, but rather a tilting of that discussion on the harms and this presumption of negative outcomes from the technology alone rather than particular uses, user groups, or other factors. And I think the executive order actually does a pretty good job of seeking to explore the broader set of potential benefits and look at the potential harms. So when you think about some of the areas you were describing, it seeks to promote innovation and competition with research programs, expanded grant funding. There are also efforts when it comes to the education sector, and the Labor Secretary has to consult with Commerce on different training for individuals interested in a career in AI. There are efforts focused on advancing equity and civil rights. We often hear AI framed in the policy space around bias, but there's an intentional effort to discuss ways in which the technology can advance equity, advance civil rights. And you see that throughout. So I appreciate the administration's efforts to explore and seek comment in the different agency proceedings and really give the public a chance to weigh in on all of the great things that the technologies can be used for.
Yeah, those are really great points. Maybe I would add to it, and Harsimar, I'm interested in your perspective, because there does seem like there are components inside of the executive order where there is more attention paid, perhaps, than in other contexts where we spend time thinking about what AI regulation looks like. For example, lots of discussion around critical infrastructure as being an adopter and user of AI. Lots of questions and issues around national security, around how AI is going to either help or hurt that. Obviously, lots of issues around labor and trying to promote workforce training as people fear that jobs would be lost through the uses of these technologies, civil rights and equity related issues, obviously privacy and cybersecurity. Any of those kind of areas stick out to you as particularly interesting or novel in the way that the Biden administration is looking at it?
Yeah, Scott, I think there are two main aspects. One is around dual use foundation models, whereas most of the executive order really focuses on delegating to and directing to agencies to say, go and sort of do a request for information, talk to stakeholders and find out what the best approach should be. With respect to those dual use foundation models, if there is more of a concern around national security, national health and safety, the executive order takes an additional step to say, we want to know how you're training those models. We want to know what you're doing to test them, to red team them specifically. And so the first piece is that we're seeing a much more concrete step around the government saying, we want to know what's happening with these models. The second piece I think that really stands out is the focus of trying to use procurement standards to help influence the market overall. And so part of what the Department of Commerce is being directed to do is to say, how can we help to raise the standards or raise what diligence we should be doing around AI tools so that if a company wants to work with the federal government, they will now have to meet those standards. And while the focus there is on procurement for the federal government, it's going to have trickle-down effects where you have companies that say, if it's good enough for the government, then why isn't it good enough for our company as well, even if we're entirely in the private sector? You may have companies that straddle both lines and would like a consistent approach. And so overall, even if you're not in that sort of national security critical sector space, it's still going to help to elevate and sort of raise the market expectations overall.
Yeah, I want to hit that point in a moment, but Harsimar, I want to maybe kind of tease out something I think that you were describing. So you were indicating that the executive order, right, really the administration and the White House is directing a number of other agencies to maybe put more meat on the bone of exactly what future of AI regulation looks like within their particular sector. Each of these agencies is said to, you need to issue these types of guidance or develop these types of frameworks or these types of standards, which could have significant impact to those that are developed. But I'm wondering, what is the impact today? In the deal world, I think oftentimes when parties can't agree to something, they will include a contractual term that says, okay, the parties will agree to develop and agree to future things in the future. It's kind of like an agreement to agree, which doesn't have a lot of real world effect today because there is actually no agreement, or we're just agreeing that we're going to try to agree on something in the future. Is that what we have, or are there operative provisions that really have a real world impact today as opposed to what an expected impact will look like in the future?
I think it's closer to an expected impact in the future, but it really shows the direction of travel overall. I don't think tomorrow you're going to have a brand new set of regulations, but what we're seeing is the kickoff of a much longer policy conversation with a bunch of federal agencies to say, how are we going to look at existing authorities and how AI fits under those, as well as what recommendations might agencies make to Congress to say, we need additional authority here. Part of what the executive order is trying to navigate is the fact that the executive agencies have a certain amount of authority based off what Congress has delegated, but there are limits to that. And so we're trying to set up a foundation where the White House can go to Congress and say, we need authority to do X, Y, and Z, and here's why you should give us both the authority and the funding to do it. Without that, there may not be enough wind in the sails for the agencies to make substantive headway.
I think that's exactly right. And when you consider how wide-ranging the topical scope of this executive order really is and how many agencies are involved, it makes sense that there's already been significant coordination within the administration. And so when we see pieces in this executive order about agency rulemakings, you tend to expect that the agencies have already done a lot of thinking about the content that would go into those rulemaking. So when you're looking at this from the private sector, be mindful that things could move very quickly now going forward. The agencies under many parts of this executive order are under a timing deadline with this administration, and the order itself establishes a lot of benchmarks. And so we expect that there will be a lot of activity in the very near future, a number of simultaneous comment deadline rounds and things like that. The other piece that all of us are hoping for is that coordination by the administration will continue. It's not a great outcome here if you have each of the agencies in their particular rulemakings making inconsistent determinations, inconsistent approaches to how best to address some of the issues that may come up in the record. So hopefully that coordination will continue, but it is definitely something that from the private sector, I think there's ability for companies to help make those connections for the different agencies.
Mark, that point is a really good one because, as the folks here, know when we're working on privacy and cybersecurity issues, there is no shortage of privacy and maybe even more so cybersecurity regulators. And the reason for that is that there is not a single cybersecurity regulator, right? In other words, in the absence of somebody consuming and taking the space of saying, okay, we are the cybersecurity regulator, means that every other regulatory agency says, well, we want to be in the position of regulating cyber because nobody else is doing it. And as a result, we end up being with all of these different standards, these different, set of requirements, which can look very difficult to try to pull all together in a cohesive way that's going to both optimize the principles that inspire the regulatory obligations with the least amount of friction. And I worry, right, that the AI space is going to look very similar to maybe what we see in cyber, in that there is not a kind of quote unquote AI regulator. And instead, we have all of these agencies who are in the executive order who are asked to develop their own standards. Meanwhile, and I'm interested in your perspective too on this, is that we talked for a moment about what the EU is doing, but the states are doing a bunch of things in this particular space as well. And they have their own regulatory apparatus. The state legislatures maybe are more effective in passing legislation than the federal government. What does this look like in the end? What is our end game here? And does the executive order help or hurt that?
I mean, ultimately, I think it looks like it's time to invest in the coffee industry based on all of the data points that we're seeing. It's interesting that the executive order, for the most part, really focuses on the US and sort of stays true to that swim lane. What can the US be doing to lead on AI and protect Americans? There is also a piece that I think will become increasingly important. The Commerce Secretary, within 270 days, so it's a shorter period than a year, has to have a plan for global engagement to promote or develop further AI standards. And then within a year, the Secretary of State has to publish an AI global development playbook and a global AI research agenda. So in some ways, the administration is taking the view that the US will develop the agenda for the rest of the world when it comes to AI. As you mentioned, within the United States, there's a further complication, and that's the states. Unless and until the federal government preempts the states or occupies the field, and getting into some of the legal issues there between federal and state authority, we expect fully the states will continue to look at this topic. They have shown in recent years an appetite to use their longstanding consumer protection authority in new areas centered around technology. We've seen it for data protection, we've seen it for cyber, online content, online safety, and increasingly algorithms, AI, and machine learning. Now, my sense is we really need to continue to think of AI as a global technology. It does nobody any favors if, for example, a technology that's looking to develop new patterns and trend lines and identify early onset symptoms and so forth for different health scenarios to be able to use only the data of individuals in a certain part of the world, or you have these other restrictions, and we really need to be thinking about a harmonized standard. So it's one thing to be focused on how you might harmonize different major regions of the world. But if we start getting into a discussion about 50 different frameworks within the United States, we're not getting anywhere. And so my hope is that over the long term here, we'll see continued federal leadership. There may be some role for the states, but I think the notion that there would be 50 different frameworks and ways to go about AI is just as unappetizing as a scenario in which the federal government fails to coordinate within itself.
Yeah, and on that point, maybe Harsimar, I'm interested in your perspective on this, because I think you made the point earlier is that in some ways this EO is novel in that it provided kind of a cohesive and comprehensive view that cut across multiple different agencies. But the federal government and different aspects of the federal government have been talking about AI for a while and introducing all different types of ways of thinking about that in terms of standards in different agencies. Do you have kind of a perspective on how this fits in to some of those historical executive orders or those historical agency related guidances on the uses and developments of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so I would actually untangle those two. And I think in terms of previous executive orders, one of the issues we saw there was that agencies didn't have the capacity to actually effectuate the order in the same way that may have originally been intended. I'm thinking of the AI executive order that came out just before this one during the Trump administration. And part of the requirement there was for agencies to publish a list of their AI applications that they were using. And we saw agencies start to interpret that requirement very differently, where some agencies said, okay, we're only going to focus on external facing uses, but not ones that are wholly internal. And then other agencies that said, actually, we're not defining AI very broadly, so we don't have anything to report at all. So in terms of the previous executive orders, I think it's a sign that even with the tight timeline, we may see agencies approach this very differently, depending on what their, overarching priorities are. If there's another issue, AI may get bumped down to the list, and they may do, whatever minimum they can in order to make sure they're okay come the 90-day deadline. On the other hand, you have Congress who, like you mentioned, very, very strong appetite for regulating AI. I think everyone has an understanding that something needs to be done here. The tricky part is that no one can really agree just yet on what that needs to happen. And so in terms of how the executive order might help to move the conversation along, it may help to iron out some of those wrinkles around what regulation should look like so that Congress can come together. I will say, Mark, to your point about, nobody wants 50 states to have different standards. I think I'm a little bit of a pessimist in that, there's strong consensus around the substantive requirements in the privacy space, and yet preemption and private rights of action have prevented us from actually getting a federal standard. So I worry that we may see a similar sort of level of inaction at the federal level, and then states come in and say, well, listen, we learned our lesson from last time. We're just going to take the plunge now.
I fully agree. And I think there's a fair reading that part of the drive behind this executive order is that Congress had not previously in recent years, taken action to address these issues.
But I mean, both of you are saying something I think maybe that's really important, and maybe it's like the lead in this that is not often discussed, and that is this is hard, right? I mean, trying to define what artificial intelligence is a hard thing to do, let alone trying to figure out like how to manage what may well be kind of a fundamental technology going forward and anticipating what it can do. And so reasonable minds are going to differ about what to do here for a number of different purposes, which makes me think right now I'm in Las Vegas and I can feel like I can bet on anything. Like there's not a sports game that I can't bet on, and I can bet on that there's going to be, a field goal at, exactly 11:43 in the morning, right? Every little thing. I feel like I'm going to take the over on all of these timelines for how all of these agencies need to submit all of these regulations, because how in the world are they going to do that within 90 days when we've been trying to figure out what a cohesive message looks like for the past years and not able to do it?
Well said, Scott. And it's helpful for us to all remember that it's an election year next year. So the administration either has 1 year to get this done or 5, and you get really different outcomes from these efforts, depending on which of those buckets it falls into. So I think they'll continue to stay focused on this. The timelines are ambitious. That underscores a lot in this executive order.
Harsimar, you had mentioned something that I wrote down, and I wanted to make sure we circle back to it because I think it is, in my view, one of the most important things that's going to come out of this. The standard setting, right? Even if it's not something that has the force of law, because it's something that is either guidance or it's kind of, voluntary standards, never actually makes its way into legislation, can still have a significant impact on a commercial basis, right? Because you were mentioning that one of the things that the executive order emphasizes is for the federal government to use its purchasing power to determine what standards may look like for developers of AI solutions that will then make their way into how users can be able to leverage those technologies. Interested in your thoughts on the significance of that aspect of the executive order.
So in one way, we already have a developing standard, which is the NIST AI risk management framework. So there is sort of a baseline that has been percolating through and that the federal government has been working to develop. What the executive order really does here, though, is to say, let's put a finer point on that and start to operationalize, a sort of broader voluntary framework into what concrete standards might look like. And so we end up getting what might be more practical guidance in terms of how the government may expect that framework to be operationalized, which in turn means companies now understand, okay, this is what we should be thinking about when we put this framework in place, as opposed to sort of looking at the guidance in the abstract and trying to figure out how it might apply to their situation.
So maybe I'm going to conclude by asking each of you one last question. And this is maybe something slightly different. I'm going to ask each of you to kind of step out of your role as being prominent technology, privacy, AI lawyers at Hogan Lovells, and pretend for a moment that you lead your AI teams at maybe large technology companies who are both developers and users of AI, or planned developers and users of AI in the future. And your senior team comes to you and says, "Hey, Mark, hey, Harsimar, I just listened to this great podcast on my way into work about what this executive order is going to look like. What does this mean for my organization? Is there anything that I need to do or start thinking about today?" Mark, you're the first person to answer that question.
Scott, thank you. Well, I think this goes back to my earlier coffee comment. I would want to make sure there was a consistent supply of available coffee to the team. And alongside that, an awareness among the team that it continues to be a changing legal and regulatory landscape. And we're focusing today on the US, but as you had mentioned earlier, we're seeing fast evolutions in other parts of the world as well. So in the first instance, an appreciation that what the frameworks are today and what the guidance is today may in fact shift quickly and severely going forward. And it reminds me of something we have seen over the last few years in the privacy and cyberspace, where you want to make sure that the teams have an appreciation that when GDPR went into effect, there was a lot of effort to hit the May deadlines. And then it was soon after that companies had to go back and assess the delta to get where they needed for California. And then after that, we had many further iterations. And I think we want to be prepared here that we're at an early stage of what could be a partially analogous life cycle for the legislative and regulatory developments. So making sure that people appreciate that there will be some changes and that we need to stay aware of those. So second thing, make sure somebody's actually keeping on top of the developments here globally. So work with counsel, work with your team, and understand that there is a lot happening, and be thinking about the potential impact, not only for what the company is doing now, but where the product teams, where R&D, where engineering would like to take the services going forward. So have a good sense of the road ahead on the product side so that you understand and can start building now. It's a lot easier to try to build in flexibility into things today than to try to unscramble that down the road. So those are two areas, and I think we have a very interesting 2024 ahead of us.
Really good advice. Harsimar, same question to you. Your senior executive turns to you and says, hey, I'm hearing about this executive order. What do I need to do?
I also have, I think, two things. The first is that really here it's easy to be reactive and to say the federal government is now taking this step. I'm going to just sit back and see what's happening, when this is a great time to start a conversation, both with the regulators that you work with on a consistent basis, as well as other members of industry and other broader stakeholders, to say, this is an important topic. Let's all work together to figure out what AI regulation should look like. I think there's a risk of sitting back, because then you may not be part of the conversation and may find a notice of proposed rulemaking that can be very disruptive to your business, when you could have helped to clarify things earlier on if you had been more proactive around the conversation. And then the second piece, I think, is in line with what Mark was saying, is you have to prepare for a very changing environment here. And so what that means is, at least internally, being ready to revisit decisions, maybe at the 6-month mark or the 1-year mark, to reassess or see if any developments now mean that certain positions you've taken previously are no longer as effective, or if there are other changes that need to be implemented given additional guidance from regulators. And so it's really a matter of being forward-looking and being proactive in those conversations, both internally and externally.
Harsimar, I think those are really important points. And maybe I would add something. I think that what you were describing, I think, everyone probably knows the term KYC, know your customer. I think we have to also get familiar with the term of KYR, know your regulator, because there are so many regulators that are out there, some of which may be well on your radar and others may not be. And understanding which ones are going to dictate how you can use AI in the future will necessitate you actually knowing which of those regulators have jurisdiction over your operations. And that itself is a tricky question. Harsimar, Mark, thanks so much for joining the podcast. Really enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully I'll ask both of you to come back and talk about future AI developments. And before we go, I know AI is moving very fast, and there are so many developments, not only here in the United States and globally. For those who are listening and want to stay at the leading edge of all of those developments and understand what is happening, we have a team of attorneys who are tracking the global nature of AI developments and making that content all available to everybody through our AI hub on our Engage platform. If you don't know what that is, Google it. You'll be able to find it. AI hub, Hogan Lovells tells you all you need to know about AI. And you'll be able to hear more from Mark on that platform, Harsimar on that platform, and many others. So Mark, Harsimar, thanks again for joining the podcast. With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those are your data points.